And we'd do all these kinds of things, like it'd be the PTA Down with Violence.
His dad left to buy bread and never came back. His daughter was murdered. His wife died. TV star Bill Daly made America laugh for decades, but behind the cameras, his life was falling apart. At 91, the beloved sidekick from I Dream of Jeannie and The Bob Newhart Show died alone in New Mexico. Far from Hollywood, forgotten by fans who never knew the gut-wrenching pain he suffered his entire life. Bill Daly came into the world during hard times. He was born on August 30th, 1927, in Des Moines, Iowa. But just 2 weeks after he was born, his father walked out the door to buy a loaf of bread and never came back. That single act, simple on the surface, shaped everything that followed. His mother, Fern, was left alone with a newborn baby during the Great Depression. There was no money, no support, and no one to turn to. She had to raise Bill by herself in a world that didn't have much kindness for single mothers. People often told the story of Bill's father disappearing for bread as if it were a strange joke, but there was nothing funny about it. It left a scar. And yet, what's most surprising is that the boy left behind would grow up to make people laugh for a living. Fern never gave up. She worked whatever jobs she could find to support Bill. Times were rough, but she kept her head high. She had once been a beauty pageant winner, and even when life was unkind, she held on to that grace. Bill grew up watching her struggle with pride and quiet strength. They lived on Hartford Avenue, and he remembered small pleasures like visiting the F&W Grand Dime store on Walnut Street. Those moments stood out in a childhood marked by uncertainty. The world judged single mothers harshly back then, but Fern didn't let that stop her. She did everything she could to give her son a chance. In 1939, when Bill was 12, everything changed again. Fern packed up their life and moved them to Chicago. It was a big, noisy city. Nothing like Des Moines, but it was full of life. Music poured out of clubs, actors filled the theaters, and radio shows filled homes with stories and laughter. The city buzzed with energy. For a boy like Bill, it was overwhelming and exciting all at once. Chicago was where the world began to open up. He was no longer just the boy from Iowa with a missing father. He was part of something bigger. But school was never easy for Bill. He went to Lane Technical High School, one of the top schools in the city. The classes were tough, and Bill struggled quietly. He didn't know why he had such a hard time reading and keeping up. Back then, no one talked about dyslexia. People just assumed you weren't very bright. And that's how Bill started to see himself. Years later, he would say, "I'm slow. I'm not that bright. I'm dyslexic, and I need a lot of rehearsal." It was an honest reflection of how much he had to fight just to keep up. But even with those struggles, he didn't give up. Bill Daly didn't plan on becoming a comedian. In fact, his first love was music. Back in the late 1940s, he was playing upright bass in a Midwest jazz group called Jack and the Beanstalks. He was good, really good, and the rhythm of jazz taught him how to keep time. What he didn't know then was that timing would become the most important skill of his life. During those gigs, between songs, Bill would start cracking jokes. At first, it was just to keep the crowd entertained while the band took a break. But people laughed. They liked him. Soon, some folks were coming just as much for the comedy as the music. By 1952, he wasn't just known for his bass playing. He was also known as the guy who could make a room full of strangers laugh. That same year, life threw him a curveball. He got drafted into the Army during the Korean War. At first, they stuck him in artillery training, which had nothing to do with music or comedy. But his sense of humor didn't stay hidden for long. Within 3 months, the Army moved him into their entertainment division. That's where things really started to click. He teamed up with Dick Contino, a popular accordion player, and the two of them toured basses, performing for soldiers. Bill still played bass, but his real magic happened between songs. His quick wit and warm delivery gave weary troops something to smile about. By the time he left the service in 1954, he had performed in over 200 shows. Those years not only deepened his love for performing, they also proved he could hold an audience in the toughest of settings. Once he was back home, Bill didn't waste time. He moved to Chicago and enrolled at the Goodman Theater School. It was a big leap from army shows to formal acting classes, and it wasn't easy. He worked nights as a doorman at the Drake Hotel, then hustled to early morning classes without much sleep. Sometimes, he even sold shoes or vacuum cleaners just to scrape by. But he was serious. He studied voice, movement, and stagecraft, soaking it all in. Comedy wasn't just instinct anymore, he was learning how to shape it. And his hard work started to pay off. By the time he was in his final year, producers began to notice him. He started landing small roles on local television shows. Every bit of effort during those years, every sleepless night and awkward audition, was building the foundation for what came next. After finishing school at the Goodman Theater in Chicago, he got a job at WMAQ-TV, an NBC station. At first, he worked as an announcer and a floor manager, but it didn't take long for people to notice he could do more. He moved up to become a staff director, learning how everything worked behind the scenes. This gave him a front-row seat to watch how comedy was built: timing, delivery, pacing. Even though he struggled with dyslexia, it made him sharper in other ways. Reading scripts was hard, so he learned to rely on his quick mind and fast thinking. He once joked that if he hadn't been dyslexic, he might never have learned how to be funny. The job also helped him meet people who would matter later. One of them was Bob Newhart. Daly even helped him out during a big Emmy broadcast in Chicago. While juggling his day job, he started doing stand-up comedy at night. In the late 50s and early 60s, you could find him working clubs all over the Midwest. He had been a musician before, playing stand-up bass in a jazz group after coming home from serving in the Korean War. At first, his comedy was just a few funny lines between songs, but the audience loved it. And soon, the music faded and the jokes took over. Little by little, he turned himself into a full-time comic. His style was nervous, slightly confused, but always sharp. It worked. By 1960, he was performing regularly in cities like Chicago and Cleveland, all while still clocking in at WMAQ during the day. One of those Cleveland trips changed everything. On his days off, he'd drive there to work on The Mike Douglas Show. He didn't just appear on camera, he also wrote and directed sketches. Mike Douglas saw something in him and gave him regular spots on the show. It was a small operation at first, but the show quickly took off and became nationally syndicated. Soon, it was airing in over 170 markets, reaching millions of viewers. For Daly, this was a turning point. He wasn't just some local Chicago guy anymore. His appearances on the show gave him real exposure, and the sketches let him build his style. Fast, physical, a little goofy, but always clever. He was still working his job back in Chicago, but now the industry was beginning to notice. At the same time, he started writing comedy for big names: Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, Steve Allen. These were some of the biggest variety shows on TV. Steve Allen's show, in particular, was wild and unpredictable. It helped shape modern comedy and influenced people like David Letterman and Robin Williams. Writing for these shows gave Daly a whole new skill set. Each host had a different style, and he learned to adapt his jokes accordingly. Even after landing acting roles, he kept doing side gigs like writing food commercials. That was just his way. Always working, always writing. Then came his big break. Bill Daly wasn't supposed to be on I Dream of Jeannie. The role of Roger Healy had already been promised to another actor. Everything changed at the last minute when the show's creator, Sidney Sheldon, saw Daly in a small part on Bewitched. He wasn't a big name. He wasn't even a rising star. But something about him stood out. He had this natural ease, this likability you couldn't teach. so Sheldon took a chance and gave him the part. That one decision turned a quiet comedy writer from Iowa into a household name almost overnight. Before landing the role, Daly had been working behind the scenes. He wrote jokes and bits for popular variety shows hosted by Mike Douglas, Merv Griffin, and Steve Allen. He was good at making others look funny, but he hadn't had his own moment yet. That changed in 1965. Suddenly, he was playing a goofy astronaut on a hit show, cracking jokes and stealing scenes. It wasn't planned, it wasn't expected, but it worked. And it worked because it felt so natural. On screen, Daly's Roger Healy was the wild one. Larry Hagman's Tony Nelson was the straight-laced officer trying to keep everything together. It was a classic comedy pairing, like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. Healy chased women, messed things up, and made people laugh. Nelson cleaned up the mess. Off-screen, their personalities weren't too different. Daly was lighthearted and cheerful, even when life wasn't easy. He struggled with dyslexia and had a rough childhood, but he stayed positive. He once said he chose to be happy. Hagman, on the other hand, was harder to pin down. He could be fun and funny, but also moody and unpredictable. As time went on, the mood on set changed. Hagman started drinking heavily. He'd show up with champagne, disappear into his dressing room to smoke, and sometimes act out in strange ways, like dressing in a gorilla costume or carrying an axe around. It was chaotic, but Daly didn't let it rattle him. He stayed calm, he kept the mood light. Even when things got tense, he knew how to keep it moving. Barbara Eden, who played Jeannie, often stepped away during the worst moments, but Daly stayed close. His steady presence helped hold things together. What most people didn't know was that Daly wasn't just acting, he was writing too. He had started as a comedy writer years earlier, and even after joining the cast of Jeannie, he kept writing on the side. He wrote food commercials, he wrote jokes, and during the show's 5-year run, he even wrote an episode himself. Bill Daly wasn't your typical TV star. He didn't think of himself as a great actor. In fact, he said once that he wasn't that good of an actor, but was just likable. That honesty helped shape the character that would make him famous. Howard Borden on the Bob Newhart Show. Howard was a divorced airline navigator, always jet-lagged, always confused, and always walking into Bob's apartment at exactly the wrong time. But people loved him. He was harmless, warm, and completely unaware of how strange he seemed. Bill built Howard around that feeling, someone who's tired, overwhelmed, and trying his best. That lost, foggy vibe wasn't just acting. Bill had dyslexia, which made memorizing lines difficult. Sometimes he struggled to keep things straight, and that gave Howard a natural, scattered delivery that felt real. He didn't try to cover it up. He used it. And even though he was only making $750 a week when the show started, he was just happy to be working. He knew the show was something special, even if the money didn't exactly follow. What made Bill really stand out, though, was what happened when the cameras were rolling. He didn't always stick to the script. He'd throw in a line or change the way he entered a scene, just enough to surprise everyone around him. That kept the energy alive. Bob Newhart, who played it straight, often had to stifle laughter when Bill threw him something unexpected. Suzanne Plachette, who played Bob's wife, wasn't safe either. The whole set was like that. Loose, playful, and just a little unpredictable. And when the day's work was done, they'd all head out together to a local restaurant called the Tail of the Cock. It wasn't just a cast, it was a group of friends, but working with Bob was a big shift for Bill. Before that, he'd done I Dream of Jeannie, where Larry Hagman liked to rehearse every scene over and over until it was perfect. With Bob, it was the opposite. Bob barely rehearsed. He thought it kept the show fresh. That scared Bill at first. He didn't feel fast enough, especially with dyslexia slowing him down. But despite those nerves, Bill stuck with it. He adjusted. He learned to trust the moment, And in return, he built a bond with Bob that went way back. They'd known each other since their early days in Chicago. Bill even helped Bob land a big break during a local Emmy telecast when a last-minute opening gave Bob the chance to perform. He crushed it. And Bill, watching from the sidelines, knew something big had just happened. As the Bob Newhart Show gained fans, Bill's face started showing up somewhere else, too. Match Game 73. At first, he was just a guest panelist, but his charm won people over fast. He was funny, quick, and comfortable just being himself. Eventually, he became a regular. Suddenly, he was juggling both a sitcom and a game show, running from one studio to another, cracking jokes in two very different ways. On one set, he had lines to remember. On the other, he had to think fast on his feet, but he made it work. Bill Daly was always the funny guy on screen. People loved him as Roger on I Dream of Jeannie and as Howard on the Bob Newhart Show. But when it was finally his turn to be the star, things didn't go as planned. In 1980, he landed the lead in a show called Small and Fry. He played a nervous doctor, and it seemed like this could be his big moment. After years of being the sidekick, he was now front and center. But the show barely lasted 3 months. Audiences didn't stick around, and the network pulled the plug. 8 years later, he tried again with another sitcom, starting from scratch. This time he played a divorced vet who somehow got along better with his ex-wife than he ever did when they were married. It was a clever idea, but the timing was bad. It aired on Saturday evenings when most people weren't watching TV, and like the first attempt, it didn't survive past 1 season. For Daly, these weren't just failed shows. They were missed chances. He had the talent, and people knew his face. But being the star was a different game, and the odds were stacked against him. After the Bob Newhart Show ended in 1978, Daly went back to stand-up comedy. It helped him stay active, but it didn't give him the same visibility. As the 1980s rolled in, the spotlight dimmed. He started popping up in guest roles on shows like The Love Boat and Love, American Style. These were fun appearances, but they didn't carry the same weight. Hollywood was shifting, new faces were taking over, and the older generation was being quietly pushed aside. Still, Daly didn't just sit still. In 1982 and 1983, he produced 3 TV specials called Bill Daly's Hocus Pocus Gang. The shows featured young magicians and gave Daly a chance to share his lifelong love of magic with a new generation. It wasn't sitcom fame, but it was something that mattered to him. He was finding small ways to stay creative while the industry changed around him. Then came Aleph in 1986. Daly played Dr. Larry Dykstra, a psychiatrist who shows up to deal with Aleph's bizarre behavior. It was a small role, but it worked beautifully. Fans of the Bob Newhart Show noticed the clever inside joke. Jack Riley, who had once played a neurotic patient on Newhart's show, also appeared in the same episode. Now, Riley was still anxious, and Daly was the calm doctor. It flipped their old roles in a fun way. In one scene, Daly's character sees ALF for the first time and reacts with a polite but horrified, "Oh my God!" It was classic Daly, funny, low-key, and right on the mark. That role reminded everyone that he still had perfect comic timing. But TV wasn't calling as often as it used to. In 1987, he made a big change. He moved to New Mexico and became the director of the state's film commission. It wasn't acting, but it kept him connected to the industry. He worked to bring film and TV productions to the area, using his name and experience to promote New Mexico as a filming location. It was a smart move, one that gave him purpose when acting gigs had slowed down. Years later, even after stepping away from Hollywood, he stayed active in the media. From 2006 to 2009, he was a guest host on a radio station in Albuquerque. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was just enjoying himself and staying involved. Bill Daly never fully escaped the shadow of the sidekick. His efforts to lead his own shows didn't stick, and the business moved on without him. But he adapted. He found joy in magic, in helping others, and in shaping the future of film in a different way. Bill Daly made people laugh for a living. But behind the jokes, his personal life was full of heartbreak and struggle. He got married for the first time in 1949 to Patricia Anderson. They stayed together for 27 years, through his early struggles and his big break on I Dream of Jeannie. But as his fame grew, the pressure also grew. Long hours, travel, and the spotlight slowly pulled them apart. In 1976, they divorced. Just 4 years later, he married again. Her name was Vivian Sanchez. They fell fast and hard, and soon they were touring together in a play called Lover's Leap. It sounded romantic, but working together every day was harder than they expected. After only 3 years, that marriage ended too. In 1993, Bill found love again. Her name was Becky. This time, it lasted. They were together for 17 years, until Becky passed away in 2010. By then, Bill was 83. He had lost the person who made him feel grounded in his later years. Bill also became a father, but not in the usual way. He adopted 2 children, Patrick and Kimberly. It changed his life, but it wasn't easy. During I Dream of Jeannie, he worked 12 to 14 hours a day. He once joked, "I see my kids more on TV than I do in real life." That joke had some truth to it. Even when he moved on to the Bob Newhart Show, the long workdays didn't stop. He played a carefree bachelor on screen, but off-screen, he was trying hard to be a good dad. In a 1985 interview, he said he missed a lot, including Patrick's high school graduation. He admitted it was one of his biggest regrets. Still, he did what he could. He brought the kids to set, let them see what he did, and even used their stories in his comedy. But nothing could prepare him for what happened in 2010. His daughter Kimberly, who had developmental disabilities, went missing. She was only 16. A week later, she was found murdered. It shattered him. He had just lost his wife Becky a few months earlier, and now this. In a rare interview, he said, "Losing Kimberly was like losing a part of myself. She was the light of my life." The man who made everyone laugh suddenly had nothing to smile about. The trial lasted over 3 years. Bill sat in the courtroom almost every day, quiet, in the back. The man who killed his daughter was sent to prison for life. But the damage was done. After that, Bill stepped away from the spotlight. His last role was in a small film called Horrorween in 2011. He never acted again. He settled in Albuquerque, where he lived for over 30 years before later moving to Santa Fe. He loved the calm, the quiet, and most of all, the view. His son Patrick remembered how his dad would often look out from his apartment and say, "Look at that view of the Sandia Mountains. Isn't it gorgeous?" That simple joy summed him up. Bill believed that happiness wasn't something that just happened. It was a choice you made every day. Even in retirement, he didn't completely vanish. Back in 1987, he served as director of the New Mexico Film Commission, helping bring more film projects to the area. And from 2006 to 2009, he guest hosted on a local Albuquerque radio station. He still had that sharp comic timing and warm presence, and locals loved hearing him on the air. To them, he wasn't just a TV star, he was one of their own. He still found time to reconnect with old friends from his TV days. One of the most touching moments came in 1999 when he reunited with Barbara Eden and Larry Hagman on The Donnie and Marie Show. It had been 29 years since the three of them had appeared together as the beloved stars of I Dream of Jeannie. The chemistry was still there, and fans were thrilled to see them back together. Before that, he had done 2 reunion movies for the show in the 80s and early 90s, though Hagman wasn't part of those. In 2002, the cast came together again on Larry King Live, when the show was being added to TV Land's lineup. And in 2004, Bill and Barbara Eden reunited once more at the TV Land Awards, presenting together on stage. He also joined the Bob Newhart Show crew for special anniversary episodes and even popped up on Newhart's later series in a fun guest role, showing he hadn't lost his touch. But his final years were quieter. In 2010, he suffered a heartbreaking loss when his wife Becky passed away. They had been married since 1993. After that, he moved to Santa Fe to live with his son Patrick and his family. He was still that same upbeat man, finding comfort in being close to loved ones. In August 2018, he celebrated his 91st birthday. Just 5 days later, on September 4th, he passed away peacefully at home. True to his personality, there was no big funeral, no public memorial. He had always said he didn't want people to mourn him with sadness. He wanted them to throw a party. That's how he lived, with humor, grace, and a deep appreciation for the simple joys of life. His ashes were scattered outside Santa Fe, returning him to the land he had fallen in love with so many years earlier. His son Patrick said the greatest thing his father ever gave him was his sense of humor, a gift that had once made millions laugh, and in the end lived on in the people who knew him best.